Welcome, everyone. My name is Josh Phillips. I am the CEO of Change Summer and the moderator for today's panel. It is wonderful to have everyone with us today, especially our four esteemed panelists. Dr. Felicia Nave, president of Alcorn State University, an HBCU founded in 1871 that strives to prepare graduates to be well-rounded future leaders of high character. Lisette Nieves, clinical professor at NYU and president of the Fund for the City of New York, established by the Ford Foundation in 1968 with the mandate to improve the quality of life for all New Yorkers by improving the performance of both government and nonprofits. Dan Porterfield, president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, whose mission is to foster the good society and help solve the greatest challenges of our time, which they do through convenings of diverse, nonpartisan thought leaders, creatives, scholars, and members of the public. And John King, former US Secretary of Education and president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit focused on the high academic achievement of all students, particularly those of color or living in poverty, primarily through research and advocacy. Before we begin, I want to take a few minutes to tell you about Change Summer and why we are doing this panel series. Change Summer is a nonprofit organization that partners with school organizations to create high-quality, customized summer opportunities for their students. Our programs develop students' confidence, independence, curiosity, and responsibility. We believe that turbocharging a high-quality education with the social and emotional development of excellent summer enrichment ultimately builds pathways for future connections and positions students to be successful through college, career, and life. Change Summer's work has never been more important. The undeniable reality is that the under-resourced communities from which our students come have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and the resulting economic recession. Our North Star has always been an equal opportunity for all. And now more than ever, we feel a deep responsibility to close the opportunity and fairness gaps that pervade American society. At our core, we are an advocate and driver for real sector-wide change. To that end, we developed this three-part panel series titled Real Conversations, Real Impact, during which we will tackle critical topics to catalyze the deep and lasting change required for greater equity. Today's panel is titled Implementing Anti-Racist Systemic Change in the Nonprofit Sector. From today, we hope that you will gain actionable ideas about how you can be part of real change. At Change Summer, we have begun the work to become an anti-racist organization. I want to be clear that we are not there yet. However, I feel inspired about where we are headed. We are focused on three core initiatives. First, creating a culture of inclusion, safety, and cohesion, and developing a culturally proficient team. Second, examining and revising our internal policies, including our HR and hiring policies. And third, examining and revising our camper, team, and family-facing practices, such as our social emotional learning program. As I mentioned, it is a work in progress. So many of you joining us today are in the midst of doing the same work, not just lip service to anti-racism, but taking action to change hearts, minds, and organizations. It requires a relentless focus, and it will take time. But if we stay at it, we can change this country. I have the good fortune of being connected to today's esteemed panelists in a number of ways, and I have learned so much from them about how to approach this work with authenticity and with equity always at the center. Like all of you, I look forward to learning from each of them today. This panel is not in any way scripted. Our panelists are all here to share openly and honestly. To that end, let's get started. And for the audience out there, if you have any questions for our panelists for the group, just use the chat feature on Zoom and we will take some questions towards the end of the panel. And with that, let's dive into our first question. So first question, Lisette, I will start with you, my good friend. why don't we go with, why is it important from your perspective? Why is it important, if not imperative, for organizations to become anti-racist?
Hi, Josh. Thank you for having me sit on this panel with this incredible group of colleagues. So I would say it's important if you care about the work that you do and you want it to have the most impact that it can have, the best educational outcomes, the best support for young people, then you have to look at what are the barriers or the gatekeeping pieces structurally that inhibit the outcome that you want. So for me, it's important. It's about race and having an anti-racist approach, but it's important about saying at the end of the day, why are we in this work to begin with, right? Why do we care, right? And so I care because I want to see what happens on the other end. I believe in opportunity, but I also believe that the lenses we have around understanding opportunity today are not always equitable. And so that's why it's important to have that. And then as a leader in an organization, you have to constantly assess, how am I participating in that? So thinking about your board, really important. Thinking about how you hire, how you promote, all of those things. How you think even about interns in an organization, right? Even the idea that you are going to pay interns, right? This is an important piece, right? Like just say that, how that could radically change who you have there, right? Saying, I want to look at talent that's at a community college, right? And support it, has already had an anti-racist view on it, just because we know where the pipeline is. So I put it in that framework for me of why we have to be that way, because if we care deeply about the talent that this country deserves to be capitalizing on, then we have to come to this work from a commitment through responsibility and a framework of responsibility, and not one of guilt and not one of shame. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Lisette. Dr. Nave, Dan, John, any additional comments? I don't need to be Chuck Todd on Meet the Press if you all want to just jump in whenever you feel free.
I echo Lizette's comments, and likewise, Josh, thanks for the opportunity to sit on this panel. It's very important to be inclusive. It's important that people have access and the opportunity for upward mobility, and bringing diverse perspectives around the table gives our country the best opportunity to remain competitive, to move those individuals who've historically been in poverty situations forward, to give their next generation of individuals a fighting chance to have a better life and a better opportunity. And so it's vitally important that we not just every now and then look at our policies, look at our practices, but that we continuously assess, because what may be a barrier today, or what those barriers are today, they may present themselves differently tomorrow. And that's where that constant assessment and reevaluation is important, to make sure that we remain woke and that we remain present in making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity.
I just offer a thought that that it's important for us as organizational leaders to be learning and understanding how the concept of anti-racism is evolving. It's a discourse that we all can learn from each other about. I take it to mean something that I've tried to be committed to, although I didn't have that vocabulary. I might have used the vocabulary of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I see anti-racism adding a significant measure of active resistance to racism, to trying to name it and deconstruct it, and which is a more active stance, which requires also more understanding of what is it that is discriminatory and racist and is to be dismantled. And so that is both it's not a new conversation, but it's an evolution of our conversation where we can really learn from each other. So I'll just stop there and say that I feel as if it's a great welcome change of our discourse, and we're all together trying to learn from one another about how to understand and then act as an anti-racist.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Dan. Thanks for that. We've been struggling with that at Change Summer, and I would like to think that we focused in previous years on plenty of elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It wasn't until the last 6 months or so where we, I think, have shifted towards trying to become more anti-racist. And one of the things that we've done is, it's not perfect by any means, but we put together a anti-racist rubric based on what other folks have done to kind of measure our progress from going from, let's say, a multicultural organization to an anti-racist organization, and one that is being very active and forward-thinking and proactive around different components of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And Lisette, I think you said it well, with even things like interns, right? There's, in the past, I would put out a wide net for an intern and then kind of, cobble together who we would choose. Now we're being much more intentional about what that means, the types of people we're looking for, whether we pay them. I think it's a great point. John, anything to add on this question?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for the opportunity to join you. 3 quick things I would add. One is, I think there's a national imperative here. Majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. So our economy and democracy have no future if we don't improve their educational outcomes. And our organizations have no future if we don't figure out how to build a productive, diverse workforce. 2, I think from a talent perspective, we'll be better. Our decisions will be better. Our responses to problems will be more creative if we are tapping diverse talent within our organizations. And the research evidence in the private sector is very clear on this, that diverse teams outperform teams that are not diverse because of the different perspectives. So there's, I think, a business imperative. So a national imperative, a business imperative. And then I would say this question that you've raised, that Dan raised, about moving from sort of passivity to action, I think is critical. And for me, the thing that the language of anti-racism and the work that Dr. Kendi did in sort of writing about what it takes to be anti-racist is that it shows us that if we don't do anything, we are actually complicit in the reproduction of systemic racism. And that it's not enough to say, I didn't go to the Klan rally, I didn't post nasty things on Facebook, I'm good. It's not even enough to say we did a workshop on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organization. It really is looking at every aspect of the organization's activity, from, as Lisette pointed out, who's on the board, who are the interns, when you are hiring an accounting firm or a law firm to do work for your business, right? Where you locate your business, how you design your product, the algorithms you use, all of it has to be interrogated for its impact on issues of systemic racism. And we have to hold ourselves to this higher bar of actively working to dismantle that racism.
Great. Thank you all for that. We're going to build off of that and ask a question related to boards. So I think, Lisette, you raised this as well, but Alexis Ohanian, the founder and former CEO of Reddit, recently stepped down from his position on the company's board, and he called for his replacement to be a Black American. What are your thoughts on Ohanian's action? Do you believe that people in similar positions as Ohanian should consider doing the same thing?
I think that everyone has to decide how they leverage their platform and voice for change, right? I think, Ohani, that was much more of saying to the media and to alerting folks that this is an issue, right? Whether that's a tactic or strategy I would use is, that's individually based. But I would say what I think is important is that, first of all, understanding both your informal and formal levels of power, voice, and communication of how you can make a difference in this area, right? The fact that they made a stand already and that it's part of this conversation shows the impact of that, right? Like that's an example of where you can do that, right? I would say this too. I think it's important that, and what I love right now is that there's a whole generation of young people who are holding organizations accountable and pushing them. They really are. I will say that. I see this over and over again. I see people at the top of very big organizations in my age group who are like, oh my God, our 20 and 30 somethings, boy, they have expectations of how this is supposed to look, how it's supposed to be. And I love that, right? Because I think that that's where a lot of the change and the push is. We are going this to the level of intentionality is important. So I would say, yes, as a board member, you can make that, but I would also say too, the users of Reddit and others are also pushing on some of these. Or the employees. So it's about, in some cases, folks, unfortunately, some folks have to feel it from a variety of level of stakeholders to make change. Right? So that's, I always say, I'm almost for maybe us on the panel, many of us see ourselves as key in helping drive that change, and it may be part of our value set, right? So we may not need to have that kind of, everyone around us telling us that kind of change, but I will tell you, I'm seeing this shift there. So yeah, I think it's important to use those platforms to do that. I will also say too, what I think is important, and if I were to use that platform, I would say, usually the answer is great. We need one and then we all feel better, right? I actually love the much more intentional one where we say, we need a couple who come on the board and we need them to come on together. And I have been one of the first people of color on quite a few boards that I sit on. And I'm proud that the CEOs have decided to bring on more than one at a time. Because that was the question that I had in my power position as someone who is being courted to be on a board, right? So I would say, in my perspective, it's not enough. Take one, put one in. No, I would also use a platform, make sure it's more than one.
I'll jump in and say something. As somebody who identifies as white, I know how important it is to break down the barriers to women and leaders of color being represented at all levels of an organization and on a board and in multiple numbers, as Lizette said. Lizette and I are both privileged to serve on John King's board at the Ed Trust, and it's a great experience. I hope John thinks this, that we're trying to share our social capital with John as a leader of an incredibly important civil rights education advocacy organization and research organization. And so, there's a lot to be said, I think, for trying to build boards and leadership teams, and then all the way through the organization, that's deeply inclusive and moving forward, always moving forward towards ever more inclusive, more representative of our country as a whole. It always leads to good things. It improves the organization. Would I step down from the Ed Trust to make room for another leader of color to take my place? If John and I talked about it and the board chair, and we thought that was a good thing to do, of course, you always want to be open to what is the needs of the organization. That's the big question. What does the organization need? I do think in our case, we could probably add a couple of board members. We wouldn't have to throw me off just to get even more leaders in it. but we have to be open to change. Yeah, absolutely.
So I would just add, I think we have to approach it in a diverse way with multifaceted perspectives, and equally important to have having people of color on the board. Is also important to have advocates who are may not necessarily be people of color, because I think it's important to attack it from a variety of angles and levels. And I like what Lizette said about knowing where your power position, both informal and formal, lies in order to help move the conversation. And so I think that's an individual decision. I think Dan is right. We focus on what the needs are for the board and what's going to push the agenda and getting the outcomes that we're looking for. But I think we have to look more think more strategically about it, and make sure that we have advocates as well as people of color present.
And one thing I would add is I agree with everything that's been said. I would argue that for a white leader who is committed to allyship, one of the things that could be helpful is to be the person in the room who is constantly pushing for the room to look different. You know, I have a colleague who, he won't be on a panel unless there's a young person on the panel. If it's a panel about education, he insists he won't show up if there's not a young person on the panel. And I sort of like that. And so, you know, if you are committed to diversity and you look around the room and you don't see it, being the champion to say, we've got to change who's in this room, or I'm going to bring somebody different next time to be in this room with me, that could be quite powerful and helpful. And again, I think is what's required to not only not be racist, but to be working actively to dismantle systemic racism.
Love that, John. Our third panel series, or the third part of our panel series, we will definitely have young people. So everybody should come back and watch some of our fantastic students and campers. So totally agree with you there. Let's shift gears a little bit. I want to start with Dr. Nave on this one because and everybody should chime in, but it's a little bit about HBCUs, and curious, why are HBCUs vital in changing the conversations and dynamics that have historically contributed to racist systems in our country? And just a side note here that what we're trying to do, the population that we serve at Change Summer is largely students of color. And so a lot of the things we have piggybacked off of many of the amazing things that have happened at HBCUs over the years and tried to implement those things into our program. And so would love to just hear your thoughts, Dr. Nave, and others on the importance of HBCUs.
So HBCUs have been and continue to be extremely relevant and extremely important to this whole conversation in making our country progress and move. We provide access and opportunity to students who otherwise may not have access to a higher education. But in our case, as Alcorn and other land grant institutions, we also provide outreach and information to low resourced communities to make sure that they have access to information, access to knowledge, that they're getting the training and development that they need. So as students come into our institutions, although we represent a small number of higher institutions across this country, we overproduce in terms of the number of doctors, lawyers, engineers that are produced, who are students of color, who are professionals of color. So in the absence of an HBCU, you can see where there could be an absence of those individuals performing both at every level and every realm in this country. We create leaders for tomorrow, the innovators. They're able to come to our institutions and not only learn the information that's between the pages of a book, but also to learn more about themselves, to develop more confidence, to understand their history, and to learn an environment where they don't have to deal with some of the challenges that they are presented with and not have the support systems in place at other institutions. And that's not to say that the predominantly white institutions aren't creating interventions and programs and speaking to the needs of those students. But our students have an opportunity to really thrive and grow in an environment where they can learn. And they have models and representation that they can mirror and see as a daily reminder of what their hard work, what their commitment pays off. Additionally, we educate a large number of first-generation students. So we put in the work, not just in their brain, but in their hearts. We engage them and encourage them to be actively and civically engaged in the conversation, to not shy away from it, and to push the envelope. And so HBCUs will remain and will continue to be important in this country because we serve students who have a need. We serve a niche for this country that, and it's an experience that's unlike any other.
One thing two things I really admire about the HBCU tradition of excellence in our country, on top, just building on what Dr. Nave just said, is one that I think I saw a statistic the other day that said that 75% of students in HBCUs right now are funded in part by a Pell Grant as part of the partnership of the families, the students, the school, and Pell program. So that's incredibly important. That's an engine of upward mobility and opportunity. I believe we need to double this Pell Grant quickly, but let John King talk about that, because we really need to put more resources behind the Pell Grant, and that's going to make a direct impact at Alcorn State, I hope, and every other HBCU. It's critical.
Yes.
Second thing I really admire is around the theme of culture, and I felt it again with the election of Kamala Harris as Vice President-elect. And that is tradition and the beauty and power and value of tradition that HBCUs instill in students. The Black intellectual tradition, the Black cultural tradition, the Black religious tradition, the school tradition, the Divine Nine, all this rich culture and tradition fills a student up with a sense of being part of something bigger than herself. And being part of the Black freedom struggle, being part of a culture and a community that affirms and sees and loves the student. So that really inspires me a lot.
Yeah, I would add a piece on this, which is that HBCUs have stayed focused and on track with their legacy in the way that public higher ed has not, right? Right, when we think about social mobility ladders, right? So for example, yes, there may be other public universities that collectively have a higher number of African-American students that may be attending than HBCUs. But the truth is, they may not be related to the four-year institutions. They may not be those that are going to be supported to persist in the way that they are with HBCUs. And I think that piece is extremely important because we are in a moral and ethical crisis on education right now. And when we see that public education, that we could look at four-year public education institutions and have less than 10% be African-American students in urban centers, that's criminal to me, right? That's not an issue with HBCUs. I would also say the other piece about HBCUs that I think are significant is that this idea of this nimbleness to understand the intersectional pieces of identity that are happening with other students. There's an increasing number of Latinx students that are going to HBCUs, understanding what that means. What does it mean to be first gen versus being legacy, right? Multi-generational. And so HBCUs have been unapologetically putting that forward in the narrative of what does it mean to build ourselves. And I thank Dr. Nave, who's doing that as well. So thank you so much.
And the one thing I would add, I agree with all of that, is that HBCUs are dramatically under-resourced, and that is a legacy of racism in our society, right? So the history of HBCUs starting in Reconstruction, in the aftermath of the Civil War, as institutions that were serving formerly enslaved people. From the beginning, HBCUs carried the burden of the racial wealth gap in our country. And so what you see is when you look at endowments, HBCUs tend to have very small endowments, despite their outsized positive impact on our economy, on our political class, right? HBCUs are significantly overrepresented in members of Congress and so forth, right? So they've had this huge contribution, but it's not reflected in their endowments. And so they are very dependent on tuition, which is why Dan's point about doubling Pell is so crucial. You know, Pell is our main federal source of support for low-income students to go to college. In 1980, Pell Grants accounted for about 80% of the cost of a four-year public college degree. Today, it's about 28%. Right, so we need to at least double Pell just to make it so that students are able to attend, and it's vital for HBCUs. But I would argue we also need a federal and state commitment to HBCUs and minority serving institutions, other schools that serve large numbers of Black, Latino, Native American students. We need to invest significant public resources in those institutions to do things like create, to build new buildings, to upgrade dormitories, to create new centers of excellence that allow those institutions to prepare students for green jobs and the other areas that are growing in our economy. And we ought to do that if we are serious about tackling the legacy of racism that is reflected in their lack of resources.
Thank you. We're getting a bunch of questions from the audience, but before we head there, I want to ask one question that I've always wanted to ask in this kind of a forum, so I'll ask it. The question is, in his piece, The Case for Reparations, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, quote, "Reparations beckons us to reject the intoxication of hubris and see America as it is, the work of fallible humans. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history," end quote. And the question I have is, do you believe the United States should consider reparations? And if so, what might that look like? I've never moderated an Aspen panel, but I'll take the liberty and call on my longtime friend, John King, to get us started.
Sure. Well, so I think it depends on how you define reparations. What I worry is that what some people hear is like some kind of one-time check that folks are going to get. And to my mind, that's not sufficient to accomplish what Ta-Nehisi Coates is describing there. What's necessary to accomplish that vision is a reorientation of our public sector and private sector behavior to dismantle the consequences of systemic racism. So I think about, take for example, what Change Summer does. If you look at the data, middle income and affluent students are 5 times as likely to have meaningful summer experiences as low income students. And they are at least twice as likely to go to a performance or a museum over the summer, right? So you think about Change Summer as saying, like, we're going to create for students access to the kind of sleepaway camp, outdoor experiences that other families take for granted. So to me, the vision for reparations has to be about eliminating the disparities that are a result of our history of racism. So that's access to quality early childhood education, access to a well-rounded K-12 educational experience, access to affordable, high-quality post-secondary education, access to employment. And to do that, that's not a one-time check. That is a restructuring of how our society is organized. So I just want to make sure when people are saying reparations, they are ambitious enough for what it will take.
I would, I think that the piece of the quote that you talk about that is really powerful for me is that um, quotes is really talking about, to me, the fact that we're not all starting on the same place as far as education and historical recognition of what's happened in this country. And that is one of anger and shame when you do hear it. It's for some people, and as someone who's an educator, there's some cognitive dissonance that people are going to experience when they get to hear the history. And so there is a piece of what happens emotionally to us as a group as we move through this that's really important, and that's fragile. Right. So I want to acknowledge that, because I think we don't often have those. When we talk about what are these conversations, right? Like, I think it's important to, and I always put myself back in my first year of college, and I got to read the whole Moynihan report at one time. And I have to tell you, I cried, right? What they wrote about Black families, what they wrote about Puerto Ricans, and I'm Puerto Rican. I mean, and I was so angry that this was seen as a text that has defined how we talked about people that I care so deeply about, right? Like this was not from a conservative, right? Let me make this clear, right? And I'm putting this out there because I think it's an interesting example of historically what have been the tropes and the notions that we've held on to, that we've persisted. So the reason why I stay away from the language of reparations, like John said, but it's also been constructed and politicized as a narrative that's supposed to be inherently divisive, right? And so I don't agree with necessarily owning that. So one is, I could say, I want to retake on that and create my own definition of it. I decide not to do that. And I'd rather say, what are we doing structurally that is going to make the long-term change that we want to see happen in that, right? And so this idea that, because there is this piece, I think the other thing that happens is that we often don't talk about anything that has been done historically to support one group who has been disenfranchised has helped many others as well, right? And in fact, challenge has been, particularly with African Americans, it's almost helped others disproportionately than even African Americans themselves. We could look at that with affirmative action. We could look at that in a variety of ways. That doesn't mean that it has not helped African Americans, but we know particularly white women have benefited greatly from affirmative action. That doesn't mean that we've gotten rid of sexism. I'm just saying, but I want to put out there that we have to just be conscious of, I don't want to fall in a trope. I don't want to fall in a political minefield, because the issue does become what structurally we can do to make those changes.
I agree. I think it's a minefield, and John and Lizette said it very well in terms of, it's been politicized in such a way. In having those conversations, you have to make sure it's going to evoke a certain amount of emotion on all sides, and making sure we have the right framework, so that people, as they offload these emotions, there are people there to help them work through that process. It's not enough to just get those emotions out. You have to know how to process those emotions and what to do with them, and how to take your raw emotions and turn them into positive outcomes. And so it's the education gaps and inequities, but it's also that, we're starting behind from a wealth perspective, that many of us, we're building. You are the first in your long history of generation to garner any type of wealth. So you're not starting in the same place. They're starting 10 meters in, and you're 30 meters behind. and still trying to catch up while there are all kind of roadblocks and potholes in the way that you're trying to navigate around. And so in having the conversation, I do agree with John, it has to be much broader because it's not just about a paycheck. It's about how do we systematically and comprehensively address changing the narrative and moving everybody forward.
Well, I really value hearing everybody else's thoughts about this, and I'm still thinking it through. But something I admire is my alma mater, Georgetown University, acknowledged that that as part of its history, 272 people were sold from the Maryland area where the school was based, where the school is based, sorry, where they used to live and work, to the Deep South. And that was a tremendous violation, even at the time, understood as a violation of their human rights and a contradiction to the teaching, to interpretation of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And that Georgetown, something like 170 years later, acknowledges this and says we actually need to create an approach to reparations as an institution that connects us to the today's community, the descendants, to that community's aspirations and hopes. Of course, defining exactly what's the community is complex, and then how to act. And Georgetown's story isn't done, but they've done work and they've made funds available. I believe they'll be working at this for maybe forever, but for a long, long time as a part of their institution's understanding of their identity. There was a story for Georgetown that before the story of the 272 was made public in today's time. And that story is no longer relevant. It's a new story now. It's a new institutional self-understanding because of that crime and what it represents. And so I admire that effort, although I know it's not complete. And that the word reparations in that context feels productive to me, even though it's hard to work it out. What does it mean? But I know this, I had a story of my alma mater in my head as a student and as a young graduate, and now I have a different story. And it's a more true story, it's a better story, and it's probably going to evolve more, but it's an American story. And I should have to grapple with that in today's context. It's better that we understand the wrong that was done and that we try as an institution, I don't work there now, but we try to formally commit to advancing the community and the life stories of a defined group of people that Georgetown can trace to from 1835 or whatever to right now. And so in that sense, I think the reparations conversation has led somewhere very good for that institution, very honest, but not completed. But on the point around the potential for division or for one-time impact, actions that are performative, yeah, I think we have to be careful about both those things.
Thank you, Dan. Very inspirational. Thanks for saying all that. We're going to shift to one question. We're already at 12:47, believe it or not. We're going to shift to one question from the audience. We may be able to get two. And for the first question, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. I believe either Jesse or Teddy is going to step in and ask the question for the panel.
Great. The question is, do you see a significant role for faith-based leaders going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that, I don't say it all the time, but I'm a person of deep faith. And for me, my ethics and value around this are all connected and have an enormous role of that. My faith and ethics and values say that it's much more inclusive. It's not a punitive one. It is one that goes to those that are the most in need. So for me, a lot of the frameworks um, are where faith can play a very strong central role around that. And I would argue that that has been part of traditions of resistance, of civil rights and organizing throughout Latin America, obviously throughout here in the civil rights, where that has been critical, right? We've also seen it on the opposite side, resisting change, but we cannot ignore that those have been the spaces that have allowed us historically, traditionally, to have conversations in some cases that we could not have anywhere else, right? And so I want to say that, and it is linked to that other question about reparations, because the one thing that I think is important is that why reparations becomes sometimes so much of a discussion is that for many communities of color, particularly thinking about African American communities, there is such a deep history of theft, of loss, right? And so we think of that. And so for people to not that's why I said it's so important for people to understand that your intellectual, your physical, your land, so many contributions have been stolen. When we think of theft, we think of reparations in a normal judicial sense. And so that's why those words are paired together. But I want folks, we cannot deny the history of theft as an important piece of the discussion. But I would definitely say faith-based institutions have an enormous role here.
Just Sam, I'm also hopeful that faith leaders and faith communities can play a role in overcoming our tendency to retreat to our tribe and not to interact with people across lines of difference. And, you know, as we think about the aftermath of the election and the deep divisions we have as a society, if we're going to get to a more just place, we're going to have to do a lot more cross-cultural, cross-racial, cross-class communication and then collaboration. And faith communities have tremendous potential to do that, both within their own faith community, but then bringing together faith communities. You know, you think about the civil rights movement, as Lizette mentioned, and there's a tremendous tradition of Jewish and Christian collaboration in the civil rights movement, and faith leaders sitting down together and bringing their congregations together. And we need a lot of that right now. And we even need it across region, right? I mean, I think there's been a tendency to look at the election results and divide it by blue states, red states. But when you actually dive into the data, there are deep divisions within states, divisions rural versus urban and suburban, and just conversations that folks aren't having about shared values that I think really could help us heal a lot of those divisions. And I look to faith leaders to play a critical role there.
I was just thinking a little bit about the importance to integrate the panel's themes of faith communities taking on the question of what does it mean for our faith community to be anti-racist, and that could be a productive conversation in many contexts and surprising, and create allies and dialogue that would be good for people. And I guess secondly, I would just say that that I always value when faith is brought into the conversation, because it's another way of getting to know people at their core and what they value. And you know, that's always a good thing.
Great, thank you, Jesse. I think we probably have time for one more question, and then I will close and make sure we wrap it up on time.
Great. This question was in response to Dan's answer about HBCUs, affirmation, validation, and being celebrated. All of these things contribute to the pride that exists when you attend an HBCU. What do the panelists have to say about this as it relates to students in public education in grades K through 12?
Well, this is a core passion of mine. I mean, I think the question of how do you create those spaces of affirmation within K-12 ought to be central for school boards, school districts, school leaders, charter leaders, and classroom educators. Some immediate things folks could be thinking about. One is what are kids' opportunities to see themselves reflected in the staff and leadership of their school and school community. As I said, a majority of our kids are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. And we have, in New York, for example, thousands upon thousands of students of color who are in schools and districts where there are no teachers or leaders of color. And so seeing that person who looks like you on the staff is hugely valuable. We know it has positive long-term academic effects, but it also has a positive effect on kids' self-concept. 2, curriculum, right? Do you see yourself reflected in the authors that you read? Do you see yourself reflected in the stories, the narratives that you are experiencing in your English class? Do you see yourself in the history that's taught in history class? And not just the role that systemic racism has played in our history, but examples of Black excellence and Latino excellence and Asian American excellence and Native American excellence. Is your school community one that is supportive of your socio-emotional well-being? Do you have a close relationship with an adult? Do you have opportunities to build strong, positive relationships with peers? Many of the things I know Josh thinks about all the time about how Change Summer can help to foster that for kids. So there are these intentional things that we would do if we were committed to creating that affirming environment for our students of color. But I would argue all of those things also benefit white kids. I want white kids to see teachers of color and to read Toni Morrison, right? I want white kids to have those experiences. They will be better prepared for a diverse society. So there's a lot, I think, that K-12 could learn from HBCUs about the practices, the institutional practices that create a sense of belonging.
You know, I want to jump in on here because I always think, and I'm going to be a little provocative and talk about that it's about an education ecosystem and not just assuming that the school is going to be the supporter of that, right? Because it gets very frustrating and myopic to think that that is going to be solved there. When we know that the creative energies in towns have come from after school, before school, summer programs, all these rich intermediaries, right? We know tomorrow the number of counselors that we need to actually give quality college preparedness and support with applications, and we're not willing to do it. If we did not have intermediaries, we know we couldn't get great students into Dr. Nays or Dr. Porterfield's when he was a college, but right? So for me, I really think about what is the role of the intermediaries around this and elevating that. And I would say this is an incredible opportunity because schools are also so hyper segregated. One area is that through national service and really structured a 13th year, as I talk about it, ways where we can link work, stipends, service, education. That's actually where we've seen people have more diversity in experience working together on a common value and a common goal. And that doesn't often happen in our educational environments. And so I think that we have to say, what is a unique moment in time that we can double down and say, where can we have the ed ecosystem be broader and have the support so we don't think in the ways that a school has to be the beginning, middle, and end of a child's way of learning.
And I like that in terms of the ecosystem, because it does take everyone in order to make sure that the kids are educated holistically. And that's not just going to happen in the schoolhouse. It has to happen, to the question before, in the faith-based community, the community organizations. We all have to pull together and surround these kids to make sure that they, that they are leaving feeling affirmed and confident. But it also gets back, as it links up to higher ed and down to K-12, what's the cultural competence of the instructors, the teachers, the counselors, the principals who are in front of our teachers? Are we giving them that development? Or does everyone think they're going to go back to a classroom and live in their house with a picket fence? So it's bigger than just what happens. In those examples that you was just talking about, I do math. What type of math examples are you presenting that the students of color can connect to. You know, having those examples be broader than just those basic examples that they provide. How do they show up in their educational experience? How does their community show up in their educational experience? And so in addition to making sure you have more people of color in front of them, it's also making sure that the non-people of color that's in front of them have the cultural competence in order to help them. I am concerned in this virtual environment that our students of color are being even more left behind. And that's the next conversation that we're gonna have to have. Because if we don't do something in order to address it, that's a whole generation that we will have lost.
Thank you.
I think this was recorded, so this is like a master class. These last 3 comments, and we should like pass around the transcript and take it as a challenge, because we have an opportunity. There's a teacher shortage coming or here. There's an extraordinary number of talented students of color going into college and coming out of college. Let's make teaching the most attractive, inspiring profession it can be, and go invest in those young people and get them into our classrooms so they can deliver the vision you just heard from Felicia, Lizette, and John.
Thank you, Dan. You nailed it. You all were fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists, Dr. Felicia Nave, Lisette Nieves, Dan Porterfield, and John King. Before we close, I want to ask you to consider supporting my organization, Change Summer. I started Change Summer to help close what we often refer to as the opportunity gap by ensuring children from all backgrounds experience high quality, engaging summer opportunities that build the social, emotional skills critical for college and career success. And given the pandemic, our work is as critical as it has ever been. This summer, we will operate summer programs at the University of Rhode Island for over 1,000 4th through 9th grade students from Achievement First and Uncommon Schools. And our campers will participate in a robust program consisting of swimming, athletics, arts, music, theater, and outdoor adventure. And each day, campers will take part in a dedicated social emotional activity block based on our value of the day. There's also color war, dorm cleanup, trip days to Newport and the beach. Simply put, our campers, our students really need this opportunity, which is what the group was just suggesting. I hope you'll consider making a donation. Many of you already have, so thank you in advance. If you want to make an additional donation or a new one, you can do so simply by texting CTC to 202-858-1233, CTC to 202-858-1233. And I think Jesse and Teddy will put that information in the chat. I hope everyone will join us for part 2 of our panel series, which is counteracting the effects of COVID through social emotional learning, another incredibly important topic. We'll share the date and time of that event with you soon. And in the meantime, thank you so much. Please stay safe. And to our 4 panelists, you all are people who I admire tremendously and have learned a ton from, and are the true leaders of our country and give me great hope for the future. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Josh. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.